Indigifit. Learn indigenous fitness secrets from me, a blonde gym bro. I'll teach you how to have a vegan diet, what the best brands of pea protein are, Russian kettlebell techniques, Greco-Roman wrestling, and machine circuit training for efficiency. Wait, are any of these things actually indigenous methods? No, but the whole idea of being indigifit is indigenous wisdom. Now, hopefully we all agree this seems effed up, but this is hardly even satire. People love this kind of shit. And now, hold on just a minute, because whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, you might very well agree with what I'm going to say in this video. Whether you're a conservative and you're just done hearing about all of this sort of stuff, or you're an indigenous person or a First Nations person or an ally, you might find that you agree that people like this are super annoying and actually are really problematic and really common. By which I mean loud white activists and also entrepreneurs who are often making a living doing this, who I'm going to argue are actually harming the people that they're claiming to be allies of. And I feel lucky that I learned in some anti-racism trainings that this sort of thing is really popular in like the environmental movement and the food movement. In fact, according to this article, and this article, and this article, and this book, this is exactly how the organic farming movement started. When Albert Howard founded the organic gardening movement, he was working in India promoting the confiscation of indigenous and Indian lands to create large European managed plantations. Now first, this is not a hit piece on organic agriculture. Organic farming is very important in the world today, and but we also have to acknowledge that it had a bit of an unsavory start. So Howard was there working as a state plantation manager and promoting the plantation system. And the colonial plantation system in India had one big problem, which was that the way that agriculture at the time was usually fueled in terms of the fertility was using manure. But in India, manure and dung was legally required to be used for fuel at the time. So there just wasn't enough manure to be able to operate large plantations. The small home-scale farms that were being done in India and in indigenous cultures at the time there were completely sustainable. But when they tried to make large plantations, they just didn't have a fertilizer source for it. As a diligent servant of the crown, Albert set out to solve that problem. And a recent scientific paper inspired by Darwin's work on worm and worm compost came out, and it found that by using this composting method, they could amplify a small amount of manure and make a huge amount of mass that was just as effective as the manure, would solve the colonial government's problem in India, allowing the plantation model to flourish. So Howard and his first wife set out doing experiments to solve this problem and refine the composting method. But Howard identified another problem in India, according to his notes, which he said was the Indian population. He was pretty racist, and he did not have a high opinion of them, and he felt that the Indian farmers were holding back Indian farming by not adopting his Western methods and his new composting system. Organic gardening just wasn't catching on. Albert's wife Louise came up with a plan to sell it. The Howards themselves say that she tutored Albert on how to turn the uninspiring topic of composting into flaming and passionate texts. So they came up with this story that Albert had learned these mystical techniques from Indian peasant farmers and mixed them up with all sorts of Indian mysticism. It worked, and it especially caught on in circles of imperial science and right-wing romanticism. And imbued with this mystique of indigenous wisdom, Howard went on to become the first guru of the alternative food movement. So now, let me be really clear about something, because even today, there are a lot of people who still believe that organic farming was inspired by indigenous and peasant farmers. It's become a myth of the movement, as pointed out in these articles. But these articles all show period documents, Howard's actual notes and his wife's actual notes, and those tell a different story. From those, we see him looking to solve this problem, looking into scientific research to do it, finding the solution in scientific research, and then working experimentally with his first wife, who is also a scientist and who is owed some of the credit for developing organic farming. They developed it using the scientific method and using all this. And at the same time, they were very clear from their notes that they felt that the Indian farmers at the time were using very backwards methods. They needed to westernize. and they were trying to teach and get people to adapt or adopt a suite of technologies and methods that would become organic farming, including their composting method. They deliberately had notes where they set out to build a story and create this myth for two audiences. One was to get Indians behind the idea in order to sell Indians the idea of the colonial farms and the plantation system. And two, the audience later became Europeans that they could go back to and sell workshops and sell this idea of organic farming. Now, don't get me wrong, the Howards weren't all bad or anything, and they realized that their organic farming system would solve a lot of other big societal problems. They believed it was important, and they set out to have a strategy to sell it to people, and that strategy was this myth that it was something that came out of indigenous culture in India. Now, I was taught this is sometimes called a white lie, because it's the kind of thing that seems harmless. Or, in fact, that we're actually being good allies by raising people of color up and imbuing them with, like, mystical wisdom and superpowers. But it really only benefits the white authorities and white goals. And it turns out this sort of thing probably has a long history within the environmental and food movements. I've done videos before about how when white activists were trying to create the park system, they used exactly the same kind of strategy. They did a lot of writing and pieces of like romanticizing Native American spirituality and their connection with the land and the indigenous wisdom that came from that. And the implication, the thing that they said was that, if we take this land from indigenous people and turn it into the parks, then we too can have indigenous wisdom. I mean, imagine the tortured logic there of using the idea of indigenous wisdom to justify the theft of indigenous land. Like, what's clear from both of these examples is that the lives, the history, the understanding and knowledge of the indigenous and native peoples involved were not a consideration at all. And according to teachers like this continues in the movement today. For example, I think that we have to be really careful when we tell people that permaculture is an indigenous wisdom and indigenous techniques, when most of what we're teaching are things like herb spirals, French intensive plantings, chicken tractors, French tapestry hedges, and in-garden worm composting systems, and things like that. Telling people that French intensive gardening is an indigenous technique is exactly like what Albert Howard did. This really only benefits the white teachers and podcasters that are saying it, while it distorts and erases actual indigenous history and methods. And it erases the contributions of other marginalized but non-indigenous people, such as the African Americans who coined the term regenerative agriculture and offered up the first patterns for doing it. And just like those previous generations, they're putting their own personal benefit over the lives, the knowledge, and the truth of actual indigenous people. Let's face it, there's a lot of benefits for the people who are making these claims. I mean, it would be great if I could just lie to you like Albert Howard did and said all my techniques came from these secret, mystical, indigenous people and I can teach them to you. There's a lot of white people who would buy that up because they actually do care about these indigenous methods. And there's a lot of white activists who would really applaud me for it and give me lots of likes and follows on social media. And even conservative people really actually care and want to learn indigenous methods. And when white activists sell fake indigenous ideas to people, it takes away that opportunity from actual indigenous leaders to teach them actual indigenous techniques. This does nothing to benefit indigenous people, and it only causes harm. And the way I see my role as someone who tries my best to be an ally is to actually speak truth to people in power, which means a lot of white people, to call them in to actual indigenous perspectives and the struggles that actual indigenous people have. There are a lot of white people who are conservatives who might really genuinely care about those struggles. Activists like this don't care about that. They try to put things and say things in sensationalistic ways to get likes and shares and follows instead of actually calling people in on these struggles. They put their social media fame ahead of the actual experience of these indigenous people. As always, I'm willing to hear other perspectives about this. I want to hear whether you think I'm right about this, whether you think I'm wrong about this, if there are things that I could miss that I could do better on. Thanks for watching.